Hi everyone, it's Edyta Frelik here. I'm here with Marta Usiekniewicz and would like to welcome you to American Studies Colloquium series, the first lecture in 2022. We are thrilled to have Edyta Frelik with us, who will talk about art and writing a little bit as well in a couple of minutes. And now let me introduce you to Edyta Frelik, who's assistant professor in the Department of British and American Studies at Maria Curie-Skłodowska University in Lublin, Poland. She teaches American art, history, popular culture, mass media, and film. She's the author of Painter's Work, Thomas Hart Benton, Marston Houtley, and Ad Reinhardt as writers, and Kiedy malarz pisze, jak się patrzy, wstęp do badań nad pisarstwem artystów. Her current research focuses on the persistence of anti-intellectualism in American public discourse, especially as related to the perception, including self-perception, and status of artists in the United States from the early 20th century to the present. She's the recipient of the 2021 NCN Miniatura 5 grant, funding for her project Intellectualism and Anti-Intellectualism in American Modernist Statements and Writings. And Edyta, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Agnieszka. Thank you, first of all, for the invitation. I'm really thrilled to be here. And thanks everyone for coming. And let me start with a memory from last summer. I think we need this on this gloomy afternoon. Last summer, the Center for Polish Sculpture in Orońsko hosted an exhibition of works by American sculptors with Polish roots, Ursula von Riedingswald. And since von Riedingswald attended the opening ceremony, I approached her hoping to learn more about her creative process and especially about her writings and their relation to her sculpture. 2 points pointed my curiosity. First, her monumental pieces are described as poetic. And 2, the exhibition's title, Nothing But Art, was inspired by a poem of hers, Why Do I Make Art?, which she recited at the opening. The poem enumerates raisons d'etre, which as verses bear a striking formal resemblance to the modular structure of her sculptures, consisting of cedar beams tightly fitted and stacked to form large-scale abstract shapes, reminiscent of tools, trees, rocks, vessels, and human figures. So when I asked, do you write? Von Riedingswald replied, I do. I have very many notebooks filled with writings. But she instantly qualified her admission, but I'm not a good writer. I'm not a good writer. The disclaimer didn't surprise me. I could cite many examples of visual artists who openly acknowledge their urge to write and simultaneously admit they experience unease, self-doubt, even impropriety, feeling like trespassers on premises reserved for others. And yet the history of artist writings is long and rich, in fact, richer than one might think based solely on what, and who, and what gets published. Various archives offer a wealth of unpublished material testifying that artists have more reasons to write than art historians admit, and are often equipped with literary talent few expect from those whose chief creative tool is a brush or chisel rather than a pen. So among American artists who embraced writing as their second, but not secondary profession, the example of Rockwell Kent stands out because of the sheer volume of his literary production. This prolific painter, printmaker, illustrator was also a passionate sailor and voyager, documenting his adventures in popular travel narratives and autobiographies. Thomas Hart Benton was another prolific mid-century artist, a muralist and a leading representative of so-called American scene painting, who also had literary aspirations. He wrote 3 autobiographies, 2 of them published. Additionally, he produced many highly readable essays on art, politics, etc. As an instructor at the Art Students League in New York, he tutored Jackson Pollock, who both dismissed and acknowledged Benton's influence, saying he needed it as, quote, something against which to react, end of quote. But what's relevant to this talk is not similarities or differences between the two as painters, but rather differences in their verbal expression. A dejected introvert, Pollock epitomized the inarticulate artist, not even trying to verbalize his tortured thoughts. As one critic remembers, he exploded with, quote, anti-intellectual rantings, unquote, when he was challenged to speak. Benton, in contrast, had a natural talent for absorbing stories from varied sources and recounting them in a casual and entertaining style. He placed his stories within a broader context, just as he did his murals, providing a panoramic view of American society, especially the rural and small town communities he visited during the 1920s and 30s. And here, Jackson Pollock modeled for the harmonica player. He treated painting and writing as equally effective means of making statements about himself as a creative individual who, promoting the regionalist agenda, argued for an indigenous school of American art capable of reaching a broad national audience by being accessible to common people. Benton's An Artist in America became a bestseller and catapulted him to fame. Its verbal mastery was appreciated by supporters and detractors alike. Indeed, one of the artist's severest critics, Hilton Kramer, admitted he found himself, quote, appalled and angry to see that this man, who was primarily a painter, could handle language that well, end of quote. While novelist Sinclair Lewis remarked, oh, here's a rare thing, a painter who can write. Painters who can write are not as uncommon as Lewis thought. Among Kent's and Benton's contemporaries were many artists who published widely. Commercially successful autobiographies were written by John Sloan, Norman Rockwell, Man Ray, and many others. These accounts provide more than biographical, historical, and social context for their author's visual work. Many also represent mastery of literary craft comparable to that of celebrated authors. Others, however, approach the autobiographical in unorthodox ways. For instance, Andy Warhol's autobiographies, quote unquote, are largely raw transcriptions of his recorded phone calls and conversations with his team collaborators and companions who were present around the clock in the factory, his studio. Unedited, unproofed, replete with spelling errors and phonetically transcribed background noises and mumblings, Warhol's verbal ready-mades read like parodies of conventional literary narratives, but they also seem more authentic than the polished prose of conventional autobiographies and memoirs. Warhol's texts offer themselves as language objects in which the interaction of actors and factors involved in the ongoing exchange of thoughts and words are laid bare for the enjoyment or disdain of readers. Warhol was known for ostentatious indifference to the world, though I think that the ostentation and indifference were feigned and very carefully staged. He was also famous for self-distancing from the creation of his works, and his art was often executed by his assistants following his instructions. Similarly, his books were transcribed by others from his audio recordings, following his instructions. Unlike Warhol's dispassionate texts, the audio tapes and written journals of David Wojnarowicz are saturated with intense, dramatic, and often violent emotions. Sometimes compared to Genet and Kerouac, Wojnarowicz draws readers into shockingly straightforward accounts of his turbulent suburban childhood, homelessness in New York City, and ascent to fame and infamy as one of America's most provocative artists and queer icons. His journal conveys his conflicting attitude toward linguistic expression. So let me quote Wojnarowicz. In these moments, I hate language. I hate what words are like. I hate the idea of putting these preformed gestures on the tip of my tongue, or through my lips, or through the inside of my mouth, forming sounds to approximate something that's like a cyclone, something that's like a flood, or something that's like a weather system that's out of control, that's dangerous or alarming. It just seems like sounds that have been uttered back and forth, maybe now over centuries. And it always boils down to the same meaning within those sounds, unless you're more intense uttering them, or you precede them or accompany them with certain forms of violence. Wojnarowicz's candid examination of himself as a social outcast and gay artist offers insight into mainstream America's maltreatment of its castaway visionaries. By contrast, the story of Faith Ringgold, a painter, sculptress, and mixed media artist, lacks gut-wrenching, gruesome details. And ironically, that was why in the 1980s, several publishers rejected her memoir. It was not the story of struggle and sorrow expected from a female African-American. Determined to be heard, Ringgold invented her own hybrid medium called the story quilt, in which color, textile, and text engaged in dialogue with the author's experiences as a Black woman and artist. These are communicated verbally and illustrated with complementary images. Acknowledging her debt to James Baldwin and Amiri Baraka, Ringgold employs an unpretentious and straightforward storytelling style that Maya Angelou deems beautiful. Ringgold determined her story quilts could be converted into books published for children. Like her autobiography on the right, some of these received prestigious awards. The writing artists I discussed thus far are notable for the quality of their mostly autobiographical texts and their skills with language, a medium most might assume is not their forte. It's also worth considering artists who are not only ambivalent about their literary talents, but who doubt the very legitimacy of their literary efforts, such as Henri Matisse, arguably the most important progenitor of modern painting, who remarked, quote, "One will look with astonishment upon the painter who ventures to invade the domain of the literary man," unquote. Even while acknowledging the literary accomplishments of many fellow artists, he apologizes for committing his thoughts to paint, declaring that his best spokesman is his work, unquote. He also strikes the standard anti-intellectualist chord when he declares, "My choice of colors doesn't rest on any scientific theory. I simply try to put down colors which render my sensation." Even so, Matisse acknowledges the legitimacy of theoretical reflection, observing that while knowledge of colors depends upon instinct and feeling, one could define certain laws of color and so broaden the limits of theory as it is now defined. And summing it all up, he concludes, the role of the artist, like that of the scholar, consists of seizing current truths, often repeated to him, but which will take on new meaning for him and which he will make his own when he has grasped their deepest significance. Masculine pronouns throughout. One critic notes, Matisse produced writing so good, and it's a quote, so good, that it's very difficult for anyone wanting to address his painting to stray very long from his own explanations, end of quote. Ironic then that his most memorable written statement is the one you can see here. He who wants to dedicate himself to painting should start by cutting out his tongue. And I should also say she. Photographer Alfred Stieglitz, America's earliest champion of Matisse and European modern art, shared the French master's misgivings about artists' writings. If the artist could describe in words what he does, then he would never have created it, he said. Still, Stieglitz flaunted his literary interests, inviting into his circle writers such as Waldo Frank, Paul Rosenfeld, William Carlos Williams, and Gertrude Stein, the latter of whom was for him the most important external center of authority in literary and artistic matters. Stieglitz wrote prolifically himself, and his quarterly camera work, published originally to promote photography as an art, offered its pages to men and women of letters, in the top section of the slide, and to writing artists that he mentored, in the bottom part. Despite Stieglitz's support of the literary efforts of visual artists, recognition of their writing talent was often hindered due to persistent social prejudices that were also quite revealingly found within the art world itself. Few questioned the anti-intellectual stereotype of the artist encapsulated in the French proverb, "stupid as a painter." This unflattering stereotype was challenged by painter John Marin, who didn't lack confidence in his communicative skills, but instead doubted the self-explanatory power of art, as well as the ability of others, especially critics, to comprehend and interpret it. He accepted as natural that artists, quote, write, have written, and will write and speak, unquote, for they owe it to themselves, quote, and our world to say something, unquote. With an ironic wink, however, he called his own writing gibberish, and then provocatively qualified that declaration, to me, my gibberish is as good as the other fellows, nay, better. As to me, my work is better than the other fellows. Unlike Marin, who enjoyed Stiglitz's unconditional support, Georgia O'Keeffe was forced to conceal her ambitions. The only woman in the Stiglitz circle, he promoted her as a perfect embodiment of the ideal modern woman artist. Stiglitz was convinced that American modernism, dominated by men, needed a female icon. So he made sure, mostly through his photographs of her, O'Keeffe was perceived as a female painter bound to her gender, sexuality, and body. He believed that to be modern, art should counter the repressive forces of Victorian Puritanism by celebrating the natural physicality of the body and naive, unencumbered intuition, which he also regarded as antidotes to the materialism of American society. He saw women's art, like that of children and African tribesmen, as another facet of primitivism, an unmediated record of raw and honest emotion, devoid of rational premeditation and cold calculation. And he marketed O'Keeffe as innocent, guileless, and unschooled in art history and aesthetic theories, and acclaimed her art for being immediate and non-analytical. Depicted thus, O'Keeffe was denied any claim to intellectualism, as Marsden Hartley put it. During her long life, O'Keeffe felt no need to showcase her learnedness and sometimes pretended to be quite illiterate. After her death, one of her best-kept secrets was revealed: the bookroom of her home in Abiquiu, in New Mexico, with a collection of over 3,000 volumes of poetry, fiction, philosophy, history, and art criticism, many first editions and author-signed copies. She wrote, as well as read, recording her reflections in letters to friends. And the bulk of her correspondence was, of course, with Stiglitz. Her letters proffer a psychological self-portrait which is candid, sophisticated, stark, and stylish. They reveal her evolving through a complex process of introspection, intellection, and articulation. Life writing itself in the raw, natural, honest, and resplendent. Unlike the affected verbosity of her male peers, including Stiglitz, her diction is simple and unadorned, free of hyperbole, seemingly unrefined, casual, and matter-of-fact. This seeming artlessness and lack of superfluous detail parallels her paintings, through which she strove to evoke the simple, unadorned essence of things and through minimal means achieve maximum expressive power. The picture of O'Keeffe that emerges from her words is alert, witty, and playful, smart, upfront, and pragmatic, not the untutored child and unconscious woman marketed by Stiglitz. But the self-portrait by which O'Keeffe wanted to be remembered is a short text she agreed to write at the age 89 after years of rejecting such requests. The text is truly a hybrid which eludes classification. There's no telling whether the reproductions accompanying it are intended to complement the text or vice versa. The two coexist within the unpaginated spaces enclosed by the album's covers in a dialogical and open-ended relationship. She declares at the outset, where I was born and where and how I have lived is unimportant, stripping her story of conventional biographical content and visual documentation. She describes her life only in relation to her art and its development. The most captivating moments are when she reflects on the relationship between her paintings and the words they provoke. Now, eminent art historian, critic, and curator, the late Barbara Rose, insisted in 1977 that Any serious analysis of O'Keeffe's painting must recognize the significance of her writings. But Rose's counsel has been ignored. To date, no scholarly analysis has been performed other than several articles of my own, in which I suggest that while O'Keeffe didn't aspire to literary mastery, she strategically resorted to verbal communication to challenge her public image as a silent object of the male gaze and conventional readings of her art, especially her flower paintings, as thinly veiled expressions of the dominant sense of what constituted femininity in her time. O'Keeffe's her story is quite different from that constructed by Stiglitz and his protégés and associates. It may appear strange that O'Keeffe seemingly chose to collude in crafting the prevalent public perception of her artistic persona. All the while, however, she cunningly planned to shatter stereotypes about herself, demonstrating that, as one perceptive critic put it, she, quote, was no plant, no amoeba, and no dimwit, but rather a self-possessed literate person, end of quote. Marsden Hartley, Stiglitz's most complicated artist, remarkably bought into O'Keeffe's masquerade, although pretense and camouflage were part of his own character. A gay man of small-town working-class origins, he was tormented by self-doubt, insecurity, and fear of stigmatization, even while he strove to be seen as America's preeminent modern artist, a status he aspired to and possibly deserved, but never achieved, despite his justly recognized accomplishments. Of those in the Stiglitz circle, none was more committed to literary pursuits than Hartley. Throughout his life, he composed poetry and wrote compulsively on a wide range of subjects, relentlessly seeking recognition from established writers. Admirers of his poetry include Ezra Pound, William Carlos Williams, Marian Moore, Harriet Monroe, and Mabel Dodge. Their recommendations opened for Hartley the pages of such leading little magazines as Poetry, The Little Review, and Contact, and such prestigious commercial periodicals as The Dial, The Nation, and Vanity Fair. During his tenure with Stiglitz's galleries, Hartley not only matured as a painter, producing some of his most important early works, but he amassed an impressive body of published poems. However, major collections of his essays, letters, and autobiographical writings appeared only decades after his death. Hartley was intrigued and puzzled by the nature of the interaction of imagination, intellect, and experience, and struggled to see if, quote, the heart and the mind could be removed from words, unquote, in order to discern how such separation might affect his ability to process his experience in the world, which he found ravaging and ravishing, caught between the exigency of hiding his sexual orientation and the desire to inscribe it in his works by means of a decipherable code. Words were not his last resort, but he didn't abstain from turning to them to access deeper meanings difficult to convey through images alone. Like many visual artists, he gave his works suggestive titles, incorporated words into his paintings, scribbled on the back of canvases or frames, and wrote companion pieces, discursive or poetic. Some of his most profound poems are those in which he examines the mysterious and paradoxical power of language. Claiming words tease us into believing we can use language to record and convey our thoughts and emotions, but the often disappointing results paradoxically undermine confidence in language's expressive ability, leaving us helpless and speechless in the face of the unutterable and indescribable. The biggest difficulty in appreciating Hartley are his speculations about the nature and limits of artistic expression, because he considers the whole field of creativity, and rather than contemplating the relative merits of different media, he raises universal questions relevant for all artists and writers. Moreover, his lack of intellectual discipline sometimes upset his desired equilibrium between idea and experience. When that happened, he addressed the imbalance by asserting that, quote, art is not a comfortable or an emotional issue, but a stimulating intellectual one, end of quote. His best poems fared better than his discursive texts, which today are mostly of interest to experts. Let me show you some of his later paintings. Unlike his essays' muddled logic and stilted diction, the clear, casual, conversational tone of those best poems is appealing. Allen Ginsberg considered Hartley, quote, one of the most loose and relaxed and straightforward, natural poets, unquote. And Ginsberg particularly appreciated the breadth of Hartley's vision, about which he enthused. What kind of mentality, what kind of culture, what kind of psyche, what kind of God, what kind of dreams, what kind of politics, what kind of tragedy, what kind of strike breaking, what kind of closet clean homosexuality in the small town, what the teacher taught, what we lived like, rather than imitating a foreign model. In praising what he calls an exemplary embodiment of the notion of sacred America that Whitman proposed, Ginsberg highlights the same quality art historians and critics single out when describing Hartley's impact as a painter. Hartley craved positive feedback. Lacking, his self-doubt aggravated his depressive disposition. Conversely, accolades from recognized arbiters of taste thrilled him, magnified out of proportion. So when Gertrude Stein commended him for having really done it as a painter, he took her words to literally mean that he was now, quote, and these are Hartley's words, the most important man of the moment in art, who had gone miles beyond them all, Picasso included, end of quote. Luckily for Hartley, she lacked interest in his writings. Everybody knew about her dismissive attitude towards painters' poetry. Stein famously took Picasso to task for daring to encroach upon her turf. So let me tell you what happened. In everybody's autobiography, Stein describes her altercation with Picasso. Well, as I say, when I first heard he was writing, I had a funny feeling, one does, you know. Things belong to you and writing belonged to me. There's no doubt about it. Writing belonged to me. So what vexed her was Picasso's trespassing on what she considered her territory. She didn't mince words. Your poetry is more offensive than just bad poetry. I don't know why, but it just is. And she continued, you never had any feelings about any words. Words annoy you more than they do anything else. So how can you write? You know better. You yourself know better. Picasso defended himself, throwing Stein's own words back at her. Well, he said, getting truculent, you yourself always said I was an extraordinary person. Well then, an extraordinary person can do anything. That didn't throw her off balance, especially given that she had something to hold on to, literally. Oh, I said, catching him by the lapels of his coat and shaking him. You're extraordinary within your limits, but your limits are extraordinarily there. And I said, shaking him hard, you know it. You know it as well as I know it. Don't go on trying to make me tell you it is poetry. And I shook him again. So Stein was convinced that painter's block prompted Picasso to temporarily exchange paintbrush for pen. And he soon overcame his block, producing the groundbreaking Guernica. But to Stein's dismay, he continued writing, even garnering recognition for some of his works. For instance, his play, Desire Caught by the Tail. For years after the showdown, Stein and he didn't speak with one another. Among her contemporaries, Stein possessed the most profound understanding of the idea of the avant-garde. Because she verbally captured that idea better than almost anyone else, she significantly contributed to imbuing the modern mind with the notion that aesthetic experience is equal parts ocular and intellectual, and as such, its consummation requires verbalization. Consequently, the idea that giving an account of the experience of art is a crucial component of that experience became a cornerstone of modern awareness. Some artists impulsively or consciously resisted this, while many embraced it as a chance to reconcile thought with feeling. Hardcore modernists rejected the romantic notion that the goal of the artist is to convey their feelings to their audience. While, as Clement Greenberg notes, those favoring the immediacy of feeling viewed the role of the medium as, quote, a regrettable, if necessary, physical obstacle between the artist and his audience, which in some ideal state would disappear entirely to leave the experience of the spectator or reader identical with that of the artist, end of quote. Barbara Novak, however, points out that interest in, even dedication to the irrational and impalpable with no hold on reality significantly impacted the evolution of American art, even though American indigenous clarity typically favored mathematics over the dream. But in keeping with Emerson's observation that Americans needed their dreams as well as their mathematics, some artists looked for exemplars to follow in painting's most irrational and impalpable sister art, poetry. Given that medium's ability to capture and convey the amorphous nature of the imagination and, as Novak puts it, quote, the ephemeral, fleeting stuff of the dream, unquote. Like Albert Pinkham Ryder and James McNeill Whistler before them, many 20th century artists embraced Mallarmé's idea that they should paint not the thing, but the effect that it produces, shifting emphasis from the objective to the subjective, and even more importantly, from the what to the how of communication. As Marjorie Perloff asserts, the main precept of the French poet was that poetry is, quote, language charged with meaning, which she writes, is an understanding of poetry in its classical Greek meaning as poiesis or making, with the specific understanding that language, far from being a vehicle or conduit for thoughts and feelings outside and prior to it, is itself the site of meaning making, end of quote. A consequence of artists taking clues from symbolist and anti-symbolist poets, and besides Mallarmé, also Baudelaire and Poe, was that acknowledging the problems of any art are primarily problems of its own language. In this connection, many artists for whom poeticity became a sought-after quality also discovered that verbal language, as the medium and material of writing, operates in ways strikingly analogous to the languages of the visual arts. Man Ray, the quintessential American Dadaist, exemplifies an artist who both in art and writing reconciled the key traits of the modernist aesthetics and worldview. Shunning convention, he put his hand and mind to many media, a few examples here, with, he bragged, the fearlessness indispensable to an explorer. He claimed that his creations, whatever the medium, result from, quote, experience and meditation as valid as the scientific drawing, records of thinking as well as of seeing, and instances of the brain working in perfect harmony with one's feelings, unquote. So of course, you know Man Ray, famous for experimental photographs and celebrity portraits. He remained little known as a poet, essayist, and novelist. His diverse writings were overshadowed by his autobiography that I have already mentioned, which was appreciated chiefly for its humor, anecdotal tone, and juicy details. It was not until 2016 that his collected essays, many hitherto unknown, were published, revealing an eloquent, brilliant, and provocative intellectual, one with considerable literary skill. Early on, Man Ray determined to codify his theories, rendering them orderly and coherent. He published some of his first poems, essays, and notes in his early 20s, never thinking of writing as a separate activity, but rather integral to his artistic life. As he observed, painters often feel this urge to resort to words. An inveterate punster, an aphorist, he once wrote, "If I resort to words as a last resort, as a popular resort, it doesn't imply a literary turn for the worse." As he explained, for a multidimensional artist like himself, the crucial issue is choosing the most effective medium for expression of ideas. It is not inadequacy of the medium, he wrote, nor its lack of eloquence that will lead a painter into another field of expression, but his innate sense of economy that makes him choose the most direct medium for his thoughts. So he thus placed painting and writing on the same footing as other expressive artistic forms, highlighting their analogous capabilities and capitalizing on the compatibility of images and words by combining them, and often resorting to literary terms when talking about his visual works, just as he relied on visual imagery and metaphors in his texts. Introduced to French poetry by his wife, a Belgian poet, Man Ray wrote as he painted. He collaborated with other aspiring writers to launch a poetry journal, The Glebe, which published the first anthology of Imagist poetry. He called his ready-mades and collages plastic poems. Let me show you some of them, highlighting their amorphous character by assigning them amusingly literal or fanciful titles. And the relation of the titles and the captions to the works they accompanied was at best tenuous. Man Ray insisted they shouldn't explain anything or change or affect the work. They were purely imaginary, quote, sentences that have nothing to do with the objects to which they are applied, but which add to the object, end of quote. He excelled at wordplay, which he treated as a serious exercise of what his lifelong friend Marcel Duchamp called grey matter, intended not only to amuse, but to provoke an intellectual response. Combining his love of puns, visual and verbal, with an ear for rhyme, rhythmic assonance, homophony, and alliteration, he collected aphorisms, proverbs, platitudes, superficially logical structures, and laconic observations, quote, to be melted down and recast in poetic forms. End of quote. He was particularly adept at verbal contraptions disguised as proverbs and aphorisms, which challenge routine thinking and language use. Besides concocting clever quips, witticism, and beaux mots that, as he put it, quote, originated from the pure entertainment of the mind, unquote, he proved he could also be precise and clear when communicating serious thoughts about his works and art in general. In texts devised not as companions to visual works, but as autonomous literary pieces, he tested the potential of writing as a medium of self-expression analogous to drawing. In his work, intellect and imagination go hand in hand like words and pictures. The last writing artist I would like to discuss is Robert Motherwell, a New York School abstract expressionist, an articulate intellectual. He taught at universities, lectured across the country, and edited the seminal Documents of Modern Art series, which he founded and directed. Having studied philosophy and art history, he tackled complex theoretical issues in his essays and reviews, bridging what many saw as an unbridgeable abyss between the painter and the non-painter, Motherwell's words. He did so, as one critic puts it, in, quote, a coherent prose style, which could be understood even if the art it discussed was not, unquote. Some colleagues resented his public reputation as the group's intellectual. He empathized, declaring that as an actor in this particular drama, he understood, quote, the other actors quite naturally resent one actor becoming the author as well, unquote. What upset him was the invidious implications of the word intellectual in American society, the belief that an artist must be a feeling imbecile or probably is not an artist, quote unquote. Motherwell pointed to poetry as his most significant source of ideas about art and creativity, asserting that, quote, in the end, I certainly learned more from Baudelaire and Mallarmé and Joyce than from philosophy, unquote. However, he neither imitated nor advanced their radically innovative styles in his own texts, which he composed in plain expository prose. So he didn't write poetry. Stating poetry was his preferred expressive vehicle, he declared himself a poet when working with colors and shapes on the canvas, not when writing words on paper. As a painter, he felt affinity with artists who, like Mark Rothko, quote, created a language of feeling and were able to cover the abyss, the void that the world sometimes presents with love, with sensuality and passion, unquote. Asserting that the School of New York is not intellectual, but intensely emotional, he noted, however, that, quote, its members include the most cultivated among the American artists that I know, unquote. And he contended, most people ignorantly suppose that artists are the decorators of our human existence, the aesthetes to whom the cultivated may turn when the real business of the day is done. But actually, what an artist is a person skilled in expressing human feeling. So he grounded this ostensibly quotidian observation in modern aesthetic theories, saying, quote, an artistic medium is the only thing in human existence that has precisely the same range of sensed feeling as people themselves do. And it's only when you think of the medium as having the same potential as another human being that you begin to see the nature of the artist's involvement as it appears to himself, unquote. So Motherwell accomplished an impressive feat by reconciling two seemingly incongruous notions. On the one hand, he contended that when he thought as a painter, he thought in paint, explaining, one can only think in painting while holding a brush before a canvas. At the same time, he acknowledged that articulation of thoughts requires resorting to verbal language. Of course, as a visually disposed painter and a writer and speaker with unique lingual intuition, Motherwell realized that of all forms of literary expression, poetry suited him. He said, quote, to it, my vocabulary works only with poetry, that is to say, with non-narrative writing, to which my visual metaphors can be matched with verbal metaphors, unquote. So Motherwell was one of those artists who consciously develop an abnormal sensitivity to a medium and are constantly able to imbue their creative process with a concrete and sensitive love for, and I'm quoting, quote, a concrete and sensitive love for his medium, her medium, that never distorts the essential nature of the medium, but respects its very nuance of being, as one respects someone one loves, end of quote. He commended Joan Miró for accomplishing this exquisite purity in his paintings, but saw its prime expression in the works of the French symbolists, from whom he wrote, Parisian painters have taken over the word poetry in speaking of what they value in painting. Embracing their superb poetic awareness, he titled his paintings with expressions from his favorite poems and invoked them in his imagery. In text, he deliberately employed poetic metaphors, insisting that poeticity was indefinable, which, he asserted, made poetry immune to dogmatic intellectualism and unnecessary rhetoric. He, for instance, cited Marx Ernst's portfolio of drawings, Natural History, as an example of, quote, an act of revolt projected from the level of poetry against the rational approach to nature as we find it in science books. It is a poetic act, he said. He called Mondrian's works a poetry of constructiveness and spotlighted the lyrical nature of Jackson Pollock's action painting. Of himself, he said, I take neither my subjects nor the modes of painting them from the world of intellectuals. I have been mainly a lyrical artist, a poet, if you like, with occasional dramatic and satirical overtones. Treating a fresh white canvas as a void, as is the poet's sheet of blank white paper, he drew a clear distinction between poetic content and poetic form, and between the lyrical and the intellectual, between emotions and reason, noting in passing that the relevance of poetry for art stems from the fact that, quote, the best poets have speculated much more in words about what the modern is, unquote. Finally, although he never composed poetry, claiming that his writing doesn't compare in depth or originality with his painting, Motherwell achieved in his text the same effect that defines his mastery as a painter, capturing and conveying with words the concrete felt pattern of his senses and his mind. American high modernism culminated in the 1960s with the explosion of both compulsive writing and literary talent among the conceptualists and minimalists. The movement's leading figures, Robert Smithson, Donald Judd, Carl Andre, Joseph Kosuth, Anne Truitt, and Robert Morris, were, from left to right, were not just visual artists who also wrote. Not just visual artists who also wrote. Writing was for them one of the essential making procedures, inseparable from other creative practices. So let me conclude by citing Robert Smithson, whose interest in concrete poetry led him to explore the visual possibilities of language in many works, reflecting his belief that language, quote, is matter. Language is matter, not ideas, printed matter. End of quote. In some drawings, the text finds its visual equivalent as in concrete poetry. In others, it is used disjunctively, unrelated to any discernible image structure. And the press release Smithson wrote for a show based on language brilliantly, albeit challengingly, sums up many of the key ideas presented in this talk. So here, to conclude, are Robert Smithson's words. Language is built, not written. Yet, discursive literalness is apt to be a container for a radical metaphor. Banal words function as feeble phenomena that fall into their own mental box of meaning. An emotion is suggested and demolished in one glance by certain words. Other words constantly shift or invert themselves without ending. These could be called suspended words. Simple statements are often based on language fears and sometimes result in dogma or nonsense. Words for mental processes are all derived from physical things. References are often reversed so that the object takes the place of the word. So this is all from Robert Smithson and from myself. Thank you.
I don't think I have a question, Edyta, but I have a comment, and I apologize. I know that's the worst kind of response to a talk.
Go ahead.
But when you were, one of the poems that we discuss with our students in like an introductory class in American literature is Why I'm Not a Painter by O'Hara. And throughout your talk, I was like constantly reminded of this poem that accounts for paintings, that accounts, obviously I started speaking and someone started drilling just behind my wall, so that's perfect.
Never mind, we can't hear.
Yeah, so basically I was thinking, you know, of this, and then you also mentioned the kind of tension between Picasso and Stein, and obviously Stein wrote a poem called The Portrait of Picasso. So I was constantly thinking of this like tensions between those forms of artistic expression that more, I think to me, more than prose, encourage the audience to kind of project quite a lot of their own interpretation onto them. And again, this is not a question, there's not a question here, but I think a comment of like what I was thinking as you were going over so many of those artists kind of writing, not admitting to writing, and so forth.
It's a very apt comment, Marta. Thank you so much. It's apt for several reasons. Well, the first one being that you understood the gist of my talk. That was the point I was trying to make, that it is particularly with poetry where the verbal comes closest to the visual. And, you know, and we may think why. You know, I started with all those stories about painters, artists who write prose. But of course, the main point is, you know, if we want to consider artists' approach to language, what makes it special? And I do think it is a very special relation that artists have with language. I think poetry is the closest for obvious reasons, for the particular significance of the aspect of constructiveness, yes, of making sure that the words put in a poem are there, you cannot have too many of them, you cannot, they are just the words you need, they are just the building blocks, those bricks that you need, just like in a work of art, where you also have to know when to stop and why you construct this in a particular way, and what is this element doing there, even if we think of accidents, and it's always in some way planned or accepted or rejected. What gets into a poem and a work of art is just as important as what doesn't end up there. So what is present is also as important as what is absent. So I think for this reason, but also for many other reasons, if you think about what poetry really is, and particularly modern poetry, that's why modernists occupy such a huge space in my research, is this awareness of the visual, the importance of typography, etc. So yeah, the poeticity definitely. Yes, Marta, I'm happy that you listened carefully, and of course O'Hara. And there are so many poets fascinated with painting and vice versa, and considering, why am I not a painter, and what the difference is, and yes. So there is this interesting tension, fascination at the same time. And what I started with, Ursula von Riedingsvart saying, but I'm not a good painter. Writer, sorry, I'm not a good writer, is so typical. I mean, I interviewed several artists, and this is what they say. The ones who left so many writings behind them, on the one hand, wanted to keep them separate from their art. I mean, it's different in every case. I shouldn't make any generalizations here, but yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that. And
we
I'm
can't
so glad
hear
that
you, Marta. I can't hear you.
Oh.
Okay. Now it's okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have drilling here, slow internet, all of the benefits of an online meeting.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I encourage our audience to indicate if you want to ask a question, either raise your hand or put or paste it in the chat, but benefiting from another slot that I can take up. I wanted to ask you a bit more, if you could comment on Georgia O'Keeffe, because this is something I wasn't aware of. I mean, I knew that there was tension and some kind of exploitation between Stiglitz and O'Keeffe. So I was wondering if you would be willing to say a bit more, even more about this relationship between them and the...
Well, it's a long story.
Okay, so just the juicy details.
Because on the one hand, and let me talk about this through her writings, from the point of view of her written words, because we're talking about the most famous American painter who was a woman. Definitely, she's number one, known around the world. And one thing that I would like to stress is what, in our perception of O'Keeffe, what can be changed about our perception of O'Keeffe if we go through her writings. And also the question is, how do we approach her writings? Because, she wrote letters throughout her life, and she wrote letters with Stiglitz, but also with many of her friends. And this is one sort of image that of O'Keeffe that emerges from her writings. Now, the question is, can we treat those words as absolutely reliable, as this is how people approach very often artist writings, thinking that they are spontaneous, that they are going to give us the whole truth about the inner self of the artist. My question is, how reliable are those letters? So this is the first question. One, why am I asking it? She made sure that they were kept and that at some point that they could be published. Okay, so if you write with this in mind, that of course poses certain questions. Then another thing is that the O'Keeffe that emerges from her letters is like a different person from the one that emerges from her autobiographical text that I told you about, that she was persuaded to write towards the end of her life. And in it, she is the kind of O'Keeffe that she would like herself to be in the eyes of others, seen through her art, seen as a serious modernist experimenter. She doesn't even mention her marriage to Stiglitz in her autobiography. So what I'm trying to say is that artist writings are neglected. And I think this is a big mistake. You know, there's a problem with artist writings. How do we approach them? How do we treat them? Because art historians, of course, study artist writings, but they do so for biographical reasons, for, you know, explanation of their art, etc., for informational content, in other words. Literary scholars, there are very few who really do this. I mentioned Marjorie Perloff, who introduces Marcel Duchamp through his writings, Jasper Johns, John Cage. So she is interested in this. But, you know, there are no scholarly books analyzing artist writings. And it's a fascinating topic because, on the other hand, artist writings are so popular. I mean, they are bestsellers. Anthologies with artist writings are very popular, but then there is no serious literary analysis of those. And why is that? Okay, so the example of O'Keeffe would suggest that there is a lot to be discovered. Plus, as I said, there are so many writings buried in the archives. So we literally scratching only the veneer, the surface of what's beneath. And in the archives, you can discover so much. And it's also a question of canon, you know, what goes onto our, what ends up on our reading list. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Agnieszka, I think you have a question, right?
Thank you for those kind of additional explanations that you've given us. I wanted to go back to something that you mentioned in the very beginning when you were talking about Matisse, but also I think Stiglitz and the kind of disdain that they have for the written word. And I was kind of wondering if there's anything more to that. This kind of idea that the written word carries less meaning or is kind of less worthy than the sign and than the image. Is that an idea that kind of reappears in kind of contemporary times, or is this something connected with modernism as such? Or, yeah, that's the kind of question I have.
Yeah, I get it. You're asking about this tension and whether it's is an old phenomenon. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And if you're asking about contemporary art, it's more complicated because, you know, with mixed media art, digital art, you know, there are so many things going on where word and image are combined, where words and images are combined. Plus the fact that art schools teach students how to write. I mean, they have courses, MFA have courses on writing because they are prepared, you know, they are being prepared for writing artist statements, for basically advertising their work to prospective buyers. So that somehow complicates the whole picture. But this is an old thing. And if you look at what Mitchell writes about word and image in his studies, he talks about this thing in terms of a war of signs, right? There is this tension between image and word, and all those military terms are employed throughout. So obviously, I would look for answers to your questions in this old discourse of ut pictura poesis, paragone, you know, which is better for expressing this and that, you know, expressing emotions, expressing movement, etc. It's an old debate. And that's one aspect of this. But if you think about, and Matisse here is not the best example because he's not American, but if you think about American artists writing, you know, I went through so many written statements by American artists or interviews where they almost, and everybody, both those who write and who don't, talk about the problem they have with intellect, with intellectualizing, and writing is seen to be this intellectual activity. Why is that? So the question that I am investigating is also has to do with American anti-intellectualism. Yes, and with the insistence on doing, the insistence on the physical fact, and you know, anti-intellectualism in its various disguises. Yes, and also the stereotypes we have about, you know, what art is and what is art making. What is the role of thinking in the process? I'm not sure if I answered your question, Agnieszka.
I mean, you have, and you've kind of added more things that I wanted to probably mention. So this kind of anti-intellectualism or anti-intellectual strand that you mentioned. And it's interesting that the idea of what art is, of what an artist is or does, is somehow maybe a little bit different, for instance, in European context, because when I think about artists, I think about it through, again, intellectualism. I think about art schools, art degrees. I think about this, you know, tradition of fine arts schooling. But what you're saying is that from the American perspective, perhaps the stereotype is a little bit different, that the artist is a doer. It's not an intellectual who's kind of buried underneath, you know, books and you know, I don't know, let's say old books, textbooks, etc., right? But it's someone who does. So I was kind of wondering if there's anything to it, that there's this tension that also maps onto old world versus new world, or kind of transatlantic kind of tension here between what art is, what an artist is, or what is supposed to, what he or she is supposed to kind of embody.
Yes, if we think in historical terms, and you know, it's hard to say how much of that burden is still there in the 21st century, but you know, if you think about the whole story of the United States, you have this nation with no masters, you know, no tradition in the European sense. No art schools, the limited tradition. It all boils down to art being practical. I mean, art had to have a function. Yes, it had to be useful. You know, from the founding fathers, you know, the early colonies, if you think about the Puritans, well, this was a suspicious activity in the first place, yes? And it was the word that mattered. The images were sinful. But you do have colonial portraits, and they have practical function to commemorate, to show the status of the subjects. And then with the founding fathers, how can art help this new nation, etc. It is only in the 19th century that things begin to change slowly, but this inferiority complex is there definitely. And you have, all but O'Keeffe, of the Stiglitz Circle artists, but O'Keeffe traveled to Europe to learn, to study art. So it lasted well into the 20th century. And this is, well, with the Stiglitz Circle, with the early modernists, with the early American avant-garde, you have, of course, this discovery of indigenous America. But this is only then that it is beginning to change. And then, of course, post-Second World War, ascension to fame of abstract expressionism begins to slowly change things. But the mistrust remains. Yes. So it's an interesting question. How these attitudes linger. Are they still there? Anti-intellectualism is definitely still the part of very much of the now and here and now in the US. So perhaps this could also be true about art. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Do you have any other questions, maybe from the chat, or someone would like to ask something? We still have 3-4 minutes.
Yeah, I have a question. Sorry, I don't know how to raise my hand on this screen. Because you mentioned the kind of war of image and word, and the way in which the painter doesn't respect the word, and maybe the writer doesn't necessarily respect the artist. Whether this kind of tension that you mentioned, this war, is maybe resolved in the art manifesto of also, for example, the 1920s. I was just wondering if that plays a role in your research, or if you could.
If it results from the manifesto, which is a very interesting form of artist writing, I think it's a much older war, if we want to keep this phrase here. I think it's much older. There are all kinds of manifestos. I mean, the warring manifestos that you might have in mind would be the futurist manifestos, right? But I'm not sure if I can answer this question. I think the only answer I can provide is that an individual artist problem with whether to choose an image or word or language to express herself is unrelated to the generic character of the text. I don't think. Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question.
No, I don't know. I agree with you on the fact that there has been this war of word versus images that I like that kind of metaphor that you use, or this clash.
Yeah, and it's not my.
Because I know this in the context of photography, also because Agnieszka was talking about whether this still exists so much. In photography, that's definitely the case, where you give a title to a photograph, yeah, but it's often seen as though the title should not explain too much, because if you explain too much in the title, then clearly your photograph was too weak to kind of express the idea that you were trying to express. So this phobia for words exists in the visual arts in that sense. And you could make the opposite case as well, that for certain novelists, for writers, there's also a phobia of illustration, of having images put into their text to kind of prop up a weak text. a text that does not is not self-explanatory enough. So yes, I see that kind of tension still existing. I'm just wondering if maybe this tension is resolved in the art manifesto, where by definition the writing of the artist, of the painter, is kind of taken seriously, is not seen as maybe a threat to literature or something like that. So I was just wondering if art manifestos, because you're researching the 20s, the 1910s, and I have a sense that there's a lot of manifesto work being done there. Whether that's whether you're researching that.
Yeah, now it makes sense. Thank you for this explanation. I get it completely, and it's a question of how we approach works of art. Do we need words? Do we need explanations? Do we need, if you go to an art gallery, are you one of those who like to read what the artwork is about, or about the author, or the intention of the author? Or would you rather experience a work of art without any additional commentary and have your own? So definitely. And then manifesto, which is a very avant-garde kind of text, kind of genre, at least in terms of how popular it became with the avant-garde. Yes, is a statement of what art is to be about. And then the question is whether this is fulfilled by artworks or not. Yes, it's thank you for this explanation. And then another question, of course, is, what do we do with words that end up in photographs or paintings, in artworks? Yes, how are these isolated words treated?
Thank you, Edyta. We have one comment from Małgorzata Durska in the chat box. I'm going to read it out loud for the recording. So thank you for a wonderful talk. I just wanted to make sure that O'Keeffe did not travel to Europe. I think she did, and generally she traveled quite a lot.
Okay, thank you. Yes, but this happened only when Stiglitz died. What I meant, she wasn't one of those artists who was sent on the sojourn to learn, to study. She did it only after Stiglitz was dead. And yes, and she discovered traveling by plane. And yes, she went to different places. That's true. Thank you. I wasn't clear enough.
Okay. I don't think there are any more questions, and I think we are more or less at the end mark of our lecture. So let me thank you again. Edyta, that was wonderful, and I really enjoyed it. I think everyone enjoyed that. So I just wanted to remind everyone that we have one more lecture in our series next week, also at 5:15 p.m. with Anat Pick. And there's a little bit of information on our Facebook and on our website. So thank you, everyone, once again, and have a great evening.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming and asking questions.